Greetings and good afternoon. I'm David Brule. I chair the Nolambika Project, who is your host for the afternoon in this series. We're dedicated to providing the general public with opportunities to learn about the history, life ways, and persistence of Indigenous peoples in our region. Today, we're beginning a series of screenings that provide deep perspective to Indigenous history here in the Northeast and beyond. We always begin our events with an acknowledgement that we are all occupying and benefiting from Indigenous lands. The first peoples have lived here for tens of thousands of years in balance and reciprocity with the earth. We must continue to be thankful to this earth with whom we share the wonderful gifts of our rivers, forests, and fellow creatures who are truly our kinfolk. We give thanks for all good things. By the same token, we want to give thanks to our sponsors. The Karuna Center for Peace Building, founded 25 years ago in Amherst, Mass., has an outreach that ranges across the planet to reach more than 40 countries, many of which have been affected by violence. The Karuna Center works to support dialogue, to heal from trauma, foster reconciliation, and build inclusive government. Karuna, with support from the Mass Humanities Council, has also been convening a virtual workshop series entitled Erasure and Restoration, facilitated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies. The River Valley Co-op, based in Northampton, Massachusetts, is a role model for food cooperatives that encourage sustainability and fair trade. The River Valley Co-op has worked with Nolambika Project and others since 2016, honoring the ancestors of this land. To learn from the past as a part of healing and working together to build a better future. And now I'd like to present briefly our filmmaker, Ted Timreck, who since 1976 has been exploring and filming sites that will be the focus of the series of films that we'll be presenting over the next 4 screenings. Ted holds a research position in the associate program of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. He has been working with the museum's Arctic Studies Center since 1980. Ted has been breaking new ground with Doug Harris, as you will see. Doug Harris, whom we will meet shortly, is the moving force behind efforts to locate ceremonial stone landscapes and preserve these sites as important parts of our cultural heritage and national treasure. Together, they have blended scientific research methodology with Indigenous insights, knowledge, and wisdom to provide us with a unique and remarkable body of work that crosses cultural lines. As a reminder, after screening today's first part of this film, there will be an opportunity to ask questions of the 2 presenters. You can begin at any time putting in your questions into the Q&A icon. We want to thank Diane Dix ahead of time, who will be fielding your questions and passing them on to the 2 people. The first film will be concluded tomorrow afternoon, Sunday afternoon, beginning at 2 o'clock. Please come back and enjoy the rest of the program. And I'll turn now the rest of what I have to say over to Ted Timreck.
So I'd like to offer a short history of how this series came to be. I began shooting footage of the mysterious stone ruins of New England in 1976 and didn't finish this movie, Great Falls, until 2008. 45 years ago, I began going into the woods with a group of eccentric pioneers, Byron Dix, Betty Zinserbo, Jim Whittall, and many others. These were the original researchers who led Barry Fell to the sites that inspired him to write his first book, America, B.C. Barry Fell influenced many people with his idea that ancient Phoenicians once traveled from the Mediterranean to America, built their stone temples deep in the woods, and left messages carved into the stones that apparently only he could read. To me, this kind of thinking indicated a vacuum in Northeastern history. The sites were very unusual, but local archaeologists only suggested a colonial attitude when they insisted that European settlers were the first and only people to move large rocks in the Northeast. By 1979, working with Byron Dix, Jim Mavor, and another great archaeological researcher named William Getzman, we all came to the conclusion that in New England, there was no trace of any Phoenician presence in the archaeological record, and that these stone sites could have been created by Native Americans. Also, by 1979, the question of the stone ruins in eastern North America had become perhaps the most controversial issue in American archaeology. And at the time, our suggesting that they might be native made everybody hate us, antiquarian diffusionists and colonial-minded scientists alike. That's when, long before the internet, Will Getzman and I went down to the Smithsonian to try and find an archaeologist who could tell us if there were any new discoveries in native archaeology that might help us figure things out. We were lucky because Bill Fitzhugh from the Smithsonian's Arctic Studies Center invited us to join him and document his excavations in northern Labrador. What we saw along the Atlantic Labrador coast in terms of native ceremonial stone sites, sometimes going back 8,000 years, changed everything about the question of what these places might be. And then I had the tremendous good fortune to meet Doug Harris. We've worked together steadily ever since, and we've tried to carefully merge native and scientific voices to offer stories that help audiences begin to understand these unusual environmental and cultural resources that exist sometimes hidden in our backyards, and to introduce the very different early Eastern native history that our textbooks don't tell us about. This whole series, beginning with the stone landscapes in Great Falls, offers that story.
Now we have Doug Harris and Ted Timreck to answer your questions.
The National Met Register, until this time, had never determined eligible for its determination sites that were east of the Mississippi River. Now, sites east of the Mississippi were in fact eligible. And what we found was that there was a whole civilization east of the Mississippi that had been ignored, and that in this instance, the sites for the very first time were being considered, and they were being considered as sites because they were now being allowed to be shown through video and film, whereas in the past, it could only be presented in written format. And now, oral history at the National Register could be presented in videotape. This was a major breakthrough. This was a major change that now made it possible for tribes to have their oral histories considered on a level playing field.
Kendra would like to know, what is the relationship with the airport these days?
The relationship is one that is maintained, that is continually improving, and that has been, sites have been set aside and are not being impacted as they were previously.
And Janine wants to know whether the hill is eligible, but when will it go on to be protected?
Well, it is in fact being protected. There are procedures that will not allow for there to be any impacts on that hill. And so once it was established that this was National Register eligible, it was not to be impacted.
Joanne asks, is the site of the council fires in Northfield eligible to be on the National Register?
That has not yet been determined, but it should be. It fits all the criteria. And there is a battlefield mapping project that is considering it for that very purpose.
What role and place do the stones themselves have in holding and preserving the energies of the prayers?
Well, it would be our belief that once the prayer is spoken into the stone, that it is continuing to resonate and should be left alone, should not be altered. Stones should not be moved, should not be touched, because that prayer is still active.
Laura asks, is a map of these ceremonial stone locations published and available?
No. The concern is that the more people know, the more people will tend to attempt to want to know more, and therefore would attempt to alter what was in fact available.
And this is a question from Kate. When I registered for this program, which was really appreciated, I was asked if I was a Native American or an ally or not. I believe either of these last two options are true. Is there a clear distinction of allies?
Well, an ally expresses their ally status through what they do. It's not just what you say, but it's how you protect, how you defend what in fact is there to be protected.
And Karen thanks you for all your work and for sharing this. She said she was born and raised in Greenfield and Montague and spent many, many days of her youth exploring the woods there. She wishes she knew more about Native heritage then to have a better understanding of the land she experienced.
Well, a lot of what you need to know, you get to know by what you feel. And so you have to trust when you walk in these places that what you are feeling is in fact for you and will inform you. What someone else tells you is not always what is best for you to know. And quite often, tribal people will not speak about what they know for fear that what they know will be misinterpreted and inappropriately result in impacts to sites.
And Alec wants to know, what should we do if we come across a stone site that might be considered or perceived to be ceremonial?
First of all, leave it alone. A lot of people want to tamper with what they don't understand with the expectation that they can become more aware. But I would suggest that you would inform people in the state who have the responsibility to protect these sites, who are involved in historic preservation, and that sites would then be determined eligible for protection, and guardianship programs would be established by towns. And that is something that is slowly beginning to happen.
Eva would like you to explain that National Register eligibility and listing does not guarantee protection.
People guarantee protection. They can be informed as to what ought to be protected, but towns will have to create ordinances and then follow through with executing, I hate to use the term, but punishment, if in fact anyone breaks an ordinance that protects ceremonial stone landscapes or any other historic property.
Glenn asks, is there an update on the method of, oh golly, memorandum of understanding effort in the Northeast?
Well, there has been efforts to bring towns and tribes into better relationship and create memorandums of understanding, which combine the federal implications of federal tribal recognition and the actual powers of towns to say yay or nay about a particular activity. But it's the combining of the two of these, the federal recognition powers of tribes and the local powers of towns. If you combine those two things, then you can ultimately impact the actions of people of ill will.
And Jane would like to know, are there other ceremonial stones sites in Franklin County that still need to be recognized and preserved? If so, what can we residents do to help with this protection?
Well, the answer first is yes, there are, but the answer second is towns need to establish ordinances and incentives so that landowners will in fact protect these places. And that would vary town by town, but sometimes the incentives are tax-based. Sometimes they may be otherwise, but those are things that have to be determined location by location, town by town, county by county.
And Kathleen asks you, do the Mohegans have any sites?
Well, there are different ways of perceiving sites and being ownership. The tribes who came together took the position that we don't own these, that they were never owned. They were the responsibility, and under the National Historic Preservation Act, we are responsible for calling people's attention to the need for their protection. But in the Eurocentric sense, we don't own them. We don't have ownership.
And Tim has two questions. He has not heard mention of the Nipmuc and is curious to hear more about their role in the Great Falls history.
Well, the only thing that I can say as a non-Nipmuc person is that you mainly hear about tribes who are federally recognized. The Nipmuc had their status in question, and they are working very hard to gain federal recognition. And I believe at some point they will have that. And the greatest impact that a tribe can have is once it has its federal recognition. But that doesn't alter the fact that without federal recognition, they may have in fact been the originators of many cultural elements that are within this region.
And the second question from Tim is he's curious if there is known variation in stonework between the Pecumtuck, Nipmuc, and Narragansett.
Well, I don't have an answer for that question. There are variations in stonework, but whether or not they can be designated by tribe, that's not a knowledge that I have full awareness of.
And Erica asks, are there any resources you would recommend for an archaeologist hoping to learn more about the qualities of ceremonial stone landscapes to be able to identify them better in the field?
Well, the book Manitou is very helpful. It describes much of what Mavor and Dix saw. And the other thing is that one has to simply observe and be sensitive to what is. Ceremonial stone landscapes exist throughout the wild tracts of every state in the United States. They have cultural variations. We know for a fact that the Lakota and Dakota people have stones in the Western United States, and their articulations are distinct from those in the Eastern United States. And the more we study, the more we learn. And in some instances, the tribes hold that knowledge and can depict that knowledge. And in some instances, they no longer do. So we are in the time of learning.
And Will says recent university research on the Comanche and Lakota empires has opened my eyes to a very powerful cultural forces within North America in recent centuries, the last 500 years. Is there similar work underway to help us understand the Iroquois Mohawk domination over the Connecticut Valley region?
Well, some people would say that the Iroquois were a cultural force that was counter to the cultural developments of the other tribal peoples. And some would challenge that. So I'm not prepared to articulate or attempt to articulate a distinction between what is Iroquois and what is not. I do know that in many places which are not Iroquois, or where the Iroquois influence was not strong, there is more ceremonial stone manifestation. But I'd love to be all-knowing in that respect, but I'm not.
Haley has a question for Ted. Can you tell us more about the paintings of native life included in the film?
Sure. They're all done by David Wagner, who is a marvelous imaginer of history. And he just gets these things, I don't know from where, and puts them down. And he's collected them over a whole lifetime. And in my particular case, he very kindly gave me the chance to use all of his paintings for Northeastern Indians in my movies. I can sometimes never tell whether I'm making a movie about his paintings or his paintings just happen to be illustrating perfectly what goes into the movie. So I'm glad you singled it out. It's a real a visual asset, a very valuable teaching tool, I think, and it comes from the imagination of somebody who's very close to the land himself. So they seem to be really important, and they certainly have been important to me.
And here's another question about the airport from Lilith. What is the radius around the airport and Great Falls impacted by the traveling to and gathering of the various tribes? Did tribal movement occur from all directions?
Well, you're talking about a phenomena that occurs over thousands of years. And so, much of what we deal with now is we rightfully acknowledge is ancestral to the current tribes. And so we are just learning the science of dating when these stone features were put in place. That's something that we have not fully mastered. And when we do, we'll know a lot more.
And Peter wants to know, was ceremonial stone building only presented in Algonquin-speaking tribes, or is this something that was a nationwide practice?
Well, it would appear to have been a nationwide, and by nation, a continent-wide practice. But we are still learning who did use it and who did not. And in some instances, the people who did the work were replaced by other people. So who may be a tribe now may not have been a tribe 1,000 years ago, but there may have been other people who were engaged in cultural practices in that area. So we have not been able to define the difference between who did what and who did not.
Rochelle asks whether you can speak to why there has been such a lack of archaeological knowledge in the Northeast compared to other regions. It sounds to me like this is a question for both Doug and Ted.
Well, I think Ted should answer that. He's closer to the Smithsonian and to the knowledge of what happened with anthropology and archaeology.
Well, I can give you an example. Recently, we were developing a story, and it comes out sort of like this: the original Puritans came and really believed that the native people they encountered were not up to a level of sophistication, let's say, that where they could have the right to their own land. Okay, and that sort of opened up the ability for colonial peoples to simply remove or overtake or take away. That Puritan attitude toward natives was the basis of the starting of colleges, but like Harvard and Yale. And Harvard and Yale are the first places where you will find anthropological studies becoming formalized. And what you find there is this unconscious, perhaps, merger of the roots that started these basically Puritan schools, carrying on those attitudes, and it just kind of moved into anthropology as we know it. These were the main schools that sent out the anthropologists of the 19th century who spread all across the country looking for gold and what have you. And that becomes the basis for the rest of archaeological schools in the country. So there's this thread that goes right back to the first colonists and the first attitudes that winds up in our educational system that is so deeply embedded that we don't even think about it.
And Matt has a question for Doug. Are there many other areas of significance in Massachusetts, like Turner's Falls site, that are threatened that you hope to see preserved?
Absolutely. I'm shocked at the number of towns that I get calls from. And they say, I believe in my backyard, or I believe in my backwoods, we have ceremonial stone sites. And the fact is that they do. When investigated, most often when what is thought to be a ceremonial stone site is in fact a ceremonial stone site. So yes, they exist in Massachusetts, they exist in all of New England, they exist. I just found out about one in Virginia. uh, among the Piscataway people. And they're here. They're all across the United States. They are ancestral to all of us.
And Kelly has two questions. She's an elementary teacher in this area and has shared some of what you shared with her students. She would like to know what you think is the most pressing issue that is impacting this area currently, and what are the most important things we should share with children communities in order to improve the protection of local history.
We need to walk with our children more in the woods, and we need to point out to them what in fact may be, from your perspective, a ceremonial stone site, and then remind them of their responsibility to make sure that nobody touches a stone, nobody removes a stone, nobody alters the stones, that the past must be protected. They have a responsibility to protect what the ancients left behind.
And Kathleen lives in Uxbridge, Mass. And she said there was a site there called King Philip's Rock, which was an amazing viewpoint of the whole Blackstone Valley. She wonders if you know of any other sites in that vicinity.
Well, I've had the good fortune of visiting sites in that vicinity. And sites may appear to be different to different people. And some sites are ceremonial, ceremonial meaning that where prayers have been made. And other sites are sites that were aligned for purposes of ceremony. So in some instances, there are prayers that are being made for balance and harmony. In other instances, there are calls to celestial beings, celestial events to influence the life of the people of the time. So we are still learning much about what may in fact be a ceremonial site and why it may be a ceremonial site. Some are very clearly offerings to the Earth Mother to call for balance and harmony. But others are quite often communications to her relatives, maybe celestial beings, for reasons that we don't yet know, that may have only been known in that particular time. Ted, would you have an addition to that?
Only that that every site it's worth, with children or not, to see it in its environmental context. The place, the sense of place, is deeply connected to whatever potential spirit might be there, and that brings out the idea of understanding the environment and understanding culture in the same places, and that makes them very valuable as places for us to think about.
And Peter wants to know if we think we have found anything that could possibly be a ceremonial stone structure, who should we contact?
I would say first you want to contact your local tribe, your local federally recognized tribe or state recognized tribe. You also want to contact the State Historic Preservation Office and alert them that you know that they are supposed to be responsible, take responsibility for these. And the National Historic Preservation Act gives a role to the state, the tribes, and to the public. And we must never forget that. Out in Sandusfield, when the people protested the impacts of the gas lines, when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission did not stop the gas lines, they were exercising their public right under the National Historic Preservation Act. And so we must never forget that the public has a right. It has a right and a responsibility, and it should be coupled with the rights and responsibilities of the states and the tribes.
And Pam once asks, how do we sort through all the disturbances of the colonial farmers who moved so much of the landscape around and who we have to trust left many of these ancient features intact?
Well, in a lot of instances, colonial farmers knew the Indians around them and they knew what not to bother. And so they left those things alone. A lot of places that were not touched. The presumption is that the colonial farmer did a lot more damage than the colonial farmer did. In many cases, they stopped short of impacting. Now, you may have some people who said, oh, there's some stones. We can put that up. Let's make a wall out of that. But in other instances, they left them alone. They recognized them for what they were.
And here's a question for each of you from Glenn, for both of you. Can you speak of the astronomy associated with ceremonial stone landscapes?
Well, first thing I would suggest, is watch tomorrow, because the second half of the movie has a great deal of astronomy, and it's well represented by William Sullivan, and it's a really nice part of the whole story. So I can suggest that right off the bat.
The other thing that is beginning to be developed is the utilization of star programs. There's one called Stellar that is being used to understand why certain alignments occur the way they do, pointed towards certain stars. So we're learning more. We're becoming more aware as we utilize digital programming. And so what we're doing is that we're cycling back to what the ancients knew intuitively that we have lost. But we're regaining it through the technologies that are available to us.
And Molly has a question for Tim. Will these films be available later for viewing for those who weren't able to join today, or for reviewing for those of us who were?
Yes, of course. If you go to my website, and I could just spell this out for you. It's just T.W. Timreck, that's TIMRECK .com. That's the website, twtimreck.com. I think it's listed on Nolan Bika's page at the moment. Go there and you will find the whole series available, and would welcome all.
And to the question of who do we turn to? Your local federally recognized tribe, but the local federal recognized tribe could also turn to the United South and Eastern Tribes, an organization of tribes to which many of the tribes in this area are members, and ask them to marshal the work of tribes to work with the public. That's important. You need to recognize your responsibility and your rights, and where others are not doing what they're supposed to do, influence them. United South and Eastern Tribes.
And Sue wants to know what to do in relation to stone structures on one's property. What is the process for having them seen and evaluated, documented by members of Native community as potentially linked to any ceremonial site?
Well, I think it's appropriate for you to reach out to your local tribe, reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office, and demand that they do what says they're supposed to do in the National Historic Preservation Act. read the act yourself so that you are familiar with it. That is the guidance for the American people as to what to do.
And Natalie wants to know, how far south does the Pecumtuck territory go? Were the Connecticut River Indians cousins?
Yes. But we need to look further back. You have the contemporary tribes as we know them, but there are ancestral tribes and ancestral people who predate the tribes as they are known today. And so we have to look at the history of all of that. We have to look at the influence of the mound, what are referred to as the mound building Indians. How far east did they come? What were their influences? These are things that have not yet been thoroughly explored.
And Terry has a question for Ted. You mentioned stone structures you saw with William Fitzhugh in Labrador. Did you make a film about them, or is there somewhere that they are published?
Well, yes. First of all, the first movie I made for Nova was called The Mystery of the Lost Red Paint People. And you can get that if you just look it up. That's one that's not on my website. I'm not sure why, but that's available out there. And if you just stick with the series, you will see that we bring in everything from Labrador, Vermont. We expand from this sort of introduction to many of the other issues that talk about how this really early and incredibly unknown culture of Native people were discovered, and how they have come to light over the last, well, what did I say, 1976. The elements of this discovery are sprinkled into the rest of the movies and Hidden Landscapes. Also, we've done two more films, or actually one film that's broken into 2 hours, that goes into even more depth, focusing on what we think is under the ocean, on the floor of the Atlantic, just offshore. Actually, it's for a couple of 100 miles. It used to be solid land during the Ice Age. And the next two movies after these covers that topic. And in there, we cast even wider nets to try and show how early Native peoples were utilizing and very aware of the resources in the entire northeastern and southeastern, to a certain extent, landscape. So if it's possible to stick with the movies, all of that is taken into account and approached and talked about. Sometimes I'm sorry it takes so long, but it took a long time to make them. So and the material is there, and I think it sort of runs. We use the same style that we use here, and Doug and I have worked on all of them, so it'll all be there for you if you want to follow it up.
Ruth says, we have seen landowners refuse to let tribal representatives come on their land to evaluate whether there are ceremonial sites present. What is the legal basis of this, and what are the ways to overcome this opposition?
Well, in America, ownership is primary. However, a region, a county, a town can determine that that will not be its policy. And you, the citizens, you are the sovereigns of your town. You get to make those determinations. Now, if I have an ancestor who's buried on your property, do I have the right to help you determine what should happen to that ancestor of mine? That there's some discussion around that. But the fact is that in terms of the well-being of the remains of human beings, that should always be respected. And the progenitor should always have a responsibility and a right to help with the protection of those descendants.
And Kelly writes, many of the markers put up through the tercentenary program in towns throughout the state of Massachusetts either ignore Indigenous history or are slanted heavily toward the white perspective of events. Would your preference be to remove and replace these with more accurate information to educate, or to keep ceremonial sites more private to make sure that they are left undisturbed?
Well, there are differences in opinion. My preference is let the truth stand for itself. Let the truth speak for itself. If you know through research what actually happened, then demand that it speak for itself. And if there is a colonial misinterpretation, then do the research and get that corrected. The truth is your responsibility. You are its guardian. And if you need to ally with tribal people in order to reinforce that, then do that work. Join with the appropriate people to bring the truth to light. The truth is the truth is the truth.
Lindsay thanks both of you for sharing with us, and she's curious about glacial erratics and how they differ or relate to stonework sites featured in the film. Do erratics have ceremonial value, and are there efforts to protect them?
Well, some tribal people saw something that was not erratic in those erratics. And they may have seen spiritual things that they wish to protect, they wish to identify, they wish to acknowledge. So it's difficult to determine when a scientist uses the term glacial erratic, it just means I don't know what's here. And I would rather not tax my brain to try to figure out what's here. I'd rather say, oh, it just happened when the glacier tumbled it down. And that may not be accurate.
I can also offer that if in the next couple of films there are segments about glacial erratics with native records about what they thought about specifically glacial erratics. And we tackle that in a couple of different areas. So it's up and coming.
And Martin wants to know whether the tree cutting removal at the airport, if that had been done, could it have been done differently and more respectfully, maybe without heavy equipment? And would that have been all right?
Well, it could have been done with consultation. Consultation would have been with tribes, would have determined what would have been appropriate and what would not have been appropriate. So it was not done with consultation. And so they got what they got. They got haphazard destruction. And in some instances, tree cutting itself is one thing. Stump removal becomes destructive of the ground. And it could pull up many things that have been lying dormant for hundreds or possibly thousands of years.
And Andy asks, to what degree are the tribes in the Northeast in resurgence, and how can we help?
Well, the tribes are in resurgence. By resurgence, they are being acknowledged as having continuity with the artifacts that are existing within the cultural ground that the tribes may still occupy, and in some instances don't occupy. But the resurgence also has to do with political acknowledgement of tribes, and a part of that gets to be the kind of relationship that you, the people, you, the citizens, are willing to have with the tribal communities. Not every tribe is a casino tribe. Some are, and many aren't. And that's something that has to be examined. And you've got to talk with people. You have to consult with people. You have to find out what people are thinking, whether they are tribal or their towns. You have got to understand them better. You cannot assume anything without dialogue.
And Claire wants to know whether you have any recommendations or advice for settlers with loving intentions leading land acknowledgements in their communities.
Wow, big question. Well, I think that's a question that has to be answered by settlers. And they have to have dialogue with the indigenous people, the original people, and have to be willing to have that dialogue. It's not appropriate for me to determine for other indigenous people what they should have in it as a relationship with their settler community. That's a dialogue that they have to have, and they've got to arrive at their own conclusions.
Okay, well, we're running to the end of the questions, but I have one last one from John Hunter. And he would like to know what characteristics exist in rock sites that would identify as a Native American site. What do Manitou stones look like? How are stones altered for inclusion in these sites?
There's a variety of answers to that. And first of all, if you go there, wherever it is, and you feel it enough to question it, then you're in the midst of a place where most likely someone spent spirit time and they were calling on spirit. That it's a very difficult question to answer because ceremonial stone landscapes take many different forms. Sometimes they're the result of a person talking to a particular spirit, or they are persons who are asking for guidance. But what you feel is what you have to go by. And what you see when you feel is what you will know to then be ceremonial. In some instances, that which is ceremonial may be in the form of an animal effigy. There are many forms. And in some instances, it may be directed toward a celestial event. So these are all differences and distinctions which carry their own mark and interpretation. Ted's looked at a lot of them. What do you feel, Ted?
I even understand that there are ceremonial sites, really important ceremonial sites, that have no markings whatsoever. Perhaps there's one that had, I understood, one part of a fox jaw buried at some time in the deep past. But there, on the ground, there was nothing there. And yet, among this group of people, it was one of their most revered sites. So I think what you're saying, Doug, is absolutely right. There's no way to um, make, like every church kind of looks the same. I don't think that's the thinking that goes into this. So, and it reminds me again that every site is probably unique because every environment is unique, and there must be a reflection of an environment in a site. The altars are not put up at set places, that sort of thing. It's a much more environmentally tuned affair, it seems to me.
Sometimes they're not on the ground. Sometimes they may be in the water. You don't know where. So you have to be observant. You have to be sensitive to your own spiritual attunement as you walk through places.
And before we close, Doug and Ted, is there anything that you want to add to this conversation?
In my case, I think all these questions have been really wonderful, and a good reason to have a screening like this is so you can hear these questions and see where thinking goes, and it'll help us make the next movies better.
I think it's also important that we have been concentrating to some extent on children, because if we don't advise them that what they feel and what they hear and what they sense in places has validity, we'd like to thank Nolan Beaker for making this opportunity possible. The opportunity to create in the consciousness of the public an awareness that the ceremonial stones are still there and should be left alone.
Yes, so we've reached the end of the program, but I have one footnote that I would like to add to perhaps an answer to a question that was one of the first questions, but also that kind of follows on the coattails of this first part of the film. And that is, the question was, what's the status of those ceremonial stones at the Turners Falls Airport now? And it is a considerable success story. Just after the film was done, completed back in, what was it, Ted, maybe 2008-9, I myself got appointed to the airport commission. And that was a signal of a change of heart by the town and by the airport commission. And so I've had the role of being present at each board meeting as a commissioner and keeping an eye on these ceremonial cultural resources. So there has been tremendous change in the town, on the board of selectmen, in terms of their understanding and their desire to protect those resources that were uncovered. The Hanneman site, as well as the hill, the ceremonial hill, is now protected in perpetuity. And we expect that it will be kept in confidence and again protected through various means for all time. So it's a kind of a success story that brings a footnote to this part of the screening. So again, as you have heard a couple of times, we'll be continuing tomorrow at 2:00 to have this second segment. And I really am very pleased to see the number of people who did attend. Those of you who can still appreciate what Doug has mentioned about the Nolan Beaker Project. We are a nonprofit. We can always use some help to put on programs like this and to continue to bring you events and Indigenous people who will share their culture and their artisanship. So if you'd like to donate, that would be at the Nolan Beaker Project .org. And with that, I will thank Lise McLaughlin for all of her engineering expertise and keeping all of these moving parts working together. And I want to thank especially Doug Harris and Ted Timreck. And we will see you all tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Goodbye now.